U.S. government yesterday instituted new sanctions on Venezuela. We've already had fairly crippling sanctions on Venezuela since really the beginning of 2017, instituted in part, I think, by the Obama administration. Now, it really depends on who you talk to as to whether this was the catalyst for problems in Venezuela, or more like an accelerant. And my sense is it's an accelerant just because of the timing of stuff. But timed with that, I think there was also within Venezuela private industry who also wanted to add an accelerant to this. The whole idea being that maybe they can collapse civil society in Venezuela and weaken Maduro. Bernie Sanders has been criticized, and his foreign policy apparatus within the context of his campaign have been criticized for parroting the administration lines that Maduro is undemocratic, that he's problematic, et cetera, et cetera.
Don't forget authoritarian.
Authoritarian.
Which is the word imperialists love to use to discredit socialist governments in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, but I think there is, undeniably a strong argument that Maduro has been somewhat undemocratic. There is, I think, wide acceptance that his election was highly irregular.
Not his first one. So his
second re-election.
One. Yeah.
The re-election, highly irregular. There's a lot of people who argue that his move to dissolve the Constitution also highly problematic.
He ran on a platform of creating a new constitution and won.
I would just say, can I just say something really quick on this? Because maybe we can tease it out. But I would just say, like, Ava Gollinger, who I do respect and I've done a lot of stuff with, is not only is she close, I mean, she literally was a legal advisor to this government. And in her book, she concludes, and she's extremely aware of what the United States is doing and some of the elements of the Bolivarian movement that Maduro has clashed with, of course, now critically supported. But she basically says at the end of the book, like, I'm not going to go into details, but, like, yeah, the corruption is incredibly deep and it's really gone off the rails, including, like, putting contracts on people. So there's actual problems there.
Yeah. So I mean,
and that's not the front burner at all of the conversation right now. But it doesn't. We don't need to paint a fake rosy picture to oppose an invasion.
Exactly. And but so there's criticism there that that articulating those ideas though is you're simply parroting what the CIA is saying as a way of laying a predicate for going to war or some type of, like, various forms of either military or aggressive other types of intervention. Now, of course, when we have a sanctions regime that we have now against Venezuela, we're already being highly interventionist. And so there's some who say that it's not enough to be simply against the military intervention. Here is Bernie addressing that question, and it still won't be satisfying to some on the left, because it is acknowledging that there are problems with Maduro, and some people don't want to do that.
We have another question. I want to bring in Chanel Saldana, student at American University here in Washington. She's from Pittsburgh.
Good evening. In light of the recent events in Venezuela, you came out against U.S. intervention, a contentious stance as many in Venezuela are currently suffering at the hands of Maduro through starvation and violence, and it is clear that he will not let humanitarian aid in. Under these circumstances and moving forward, do you have a clear position on U.S. intervention overseas, both economically and militarily, for nations that are under the regimes of these oppressive dictators?
Thank you. Good question.
There are a lot of awful things happening in the world, and what's going on in Venezuela is terrible. The economy is a disaster. People are living in hunger and in fear. I strongly believe there has to be an international humanitarian effort to improve lives for the people. I think the evidence is pretty clear that the last election in Venezuela was not a free and fair election. And under international supervision, I want to see a free and fair election. But to answer your question, let me say this. I am old enough to remember the war in Vietnam. And I was as active as I could trying to keep the United States from going to war in Iraq. I was in the Congress at that point. And I am very fearful of the United States continuing to do what it has done in the past. As you know, or may know, the United States overthrew a democratically elected government in Chile and in Brazil and in Guatemala and in other countries around the world. So as someone who fervently believes in human rights and democracy, we have got to do everything that we can. But I think sometimes you have unintended consequences when a powerful nation goes in and tells people who their government will be. So my view is that whether it is Saudi Arabia, which is a despotic regime, or whether it is Venezuela, I think we have got to do everything that we can to create a democratic climate. But I do not believe in U.S. military intervention in those countries.
Why have you, Senator, why have you stopped short of calling Maduro of Venezuela a dictator?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the last election was undemocratic, but there are still democratic operations taking place in that country. The point is, what I am calling for right now is internationally supervised free elections.
I mean, I don't know how much better you could answer that question, or I should say from my perspective anyways. I mean, the idea that you can both say that like the situation there is bad. It is hard to get, it is hard to trust international efforts now. I mean, particularly in...
you cannot trust that aid convoy. That aid convoy is absolutely a Trojan horse for military intervention.
U.S. aid is just the CIA and has been condemned by the Red Cross for being too politically compromised.
But even an international response now is somewhat suspect because of what took place in Libya. But the problem is...
Thank you, Marco Rubio.
Oh, yeah, it's not like one of our own lawmakers tweeted a direct threat to kill Maduro.
Right. And let's be clear. The mandate from the UN had nothing to do with regime change. And to a certain extent, we may have, by blowing through the UN mandate, destroyed the ability for the UN to sort of respond in a measured fashion in these instances. And my support at the time for the Libya bombing anyways was predicated on the idea that the UN had determined that there was an immediate narrow threat to of a genocide, of a mass killing in Benghazi. But when essentially the Western forces, the Allied forces, overstepped that mandate, we lost China and Russia for future attempting to stop like an imminent threat. I don't think there's anything like that in Venezuela.
Right.
Certainly there's no threat to us.
Well,
but I don't think there's
I just think it's just, I know you're not saying this, but just because of how the propaganda machine is, it's like the harshest critique of Maduro that's based in reality is not even, it's in a just totally different universe than what was being alleged to have happened in Libya.
I don't see how anybody could look
it's
at what's
not even
going on
remotely
in
analogous.
Venezuela as like as more oppressive than what's going on in Saudi Arabia every single day that we don't talk about.
Or frankly more oppressive than what's being wheeled out, frankly, by Bolsonaro.
Right.
And also what's going to be more oppressive than, unfortunately, a very right-wing opposition. I mean, I think this is another thing, too, that people also just need to get used to. situations where it's not like this isolationist, oh, it's over there, whatever, don't think about it. But there are definitely scenarios where there's no morally satisfactory outcome. And in some ways, the American need, I think that like, oh, well, what's our answer to this is problematic in and of itself.
This is
because
what we
our
went through with
answer is
Syria.
always coups and invasions and in Latin America, right-wing dictatorships. So why don't we just ease out of this? And if you want to, as a citizen or in the actual NGO sector, try to have solidarity and support, great. I mean, people are still traveling to Venezuela now.
This was the same what we heard in Syria from like 2011, maybe 2012 for 3 or 4 years. And the answer is that just because something is broken does not mean that the United States can fix it. In fact, and this is the sort of the more sincere response to it, right? This is the less cynical version. Like, there's no intent for the United States to fix it. The intent is for the United States to have hegemony over the situation. But even if I was to take like the most sincere thing, which is that, you know, we want to help people, sometimes you just can't.
A finer point I'd like to see put on it, and the CNN town hall probably not the place for it, and I do think Bernie would be the best on this issue, but he talks about military intervention, and what about covert intervention or the CIA? Like, what about you as the president are you going to do to get the CIA under control?
Well, the real response should be, we're not going to intervene. We're not going to intervene militarily. We're not going to intervene, covertly. We're not going to intervene with the sanctions regime. Now, the problem with the sanctions regime is that there may be times where you would want to use sanctions, right? I mean,
yeah, in very targeted ways. I mean, the ones on Venezuela have been unremittent and punishing, and they have tried to.
And I'm unclear, like, as to why.
Well, then they can say it's a failed state.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Socialism doesn't work.
I mean, there's no doubt.
I know that. But I'm saying, like, I don't understand, like, what is the argument that we're trying to, like, what is ostensibly the justification?
Well, the ostensive justification, even under Obama, has been that Venezuela is some, like, unique
rogue.
Right. And that's insane. And it was obviously under Chavez, it was, I mean, again, not that he didn't have his problems, but he absolutely not only won his elections, he crushed them and was hugely popular.
Was putting low-cost heating oil into the Northeast as some type of Trojan horse.
No interest loans to Haiti and helping people in the Caribbean. And that's where people do need to look at it and be like, no, obviously that's the part where and I think actually, and I forget who made this point, it wasn't me, but I cannot recall the name. I think there is something with the illegitimacy of capitalism or whatever, a certain kind of faith in our system at home, and the way Trump is going to Miami and pulling up all of this like Operation Condor years politics, because it's not just Venezuela. I mean, if they go into Venezuela, there's talk about pushing to Cuba. I mean, this is very, very aggressive.
I want that hotel.
And it has to do with that sort of getting back into that. Like, Trump supposedly always says, like, Panama was easy. Like, why can't Venezuela be like Panama? And as somebody said about the invasion of Grenada, it was great TV. And so, yeah, great precursor of Trump.
By the way, on the last election, the UN would have been there. They would have been there observing it, but the opposition petitioned them not to go, because they did not want anyone to say that the election was legitimate. And also, it's really hard to find accurate information about this in the mainstream media. This is one of those situations where you're not going to find an unbiased source. So at least you should be reading alternative sources for balance.
Yeah.
Definitely Venezuela analysis
so.
and
Sure.
so on. But I would say, and I think, but even people who are like Greg Wilpert, who helped found Telesur and whose wife is a Venezuelan ambassador, I think, to Ecuador, he'll, and is at the Real News now, but he'll say, like, yeah, I mean, when Maduro didn't fix the exchange rate, that led to huge problems with capital flight and capital problems with this government. Like, again, we can, of course, read alternatives, oppose imperialism, and the best critique inside the government comes from within, from people who are legitimately committed to that project.
Yeah.
But they're marginalized right now. That's the other truth.
Yeah. I've been trying to make this case to some of my leftist friends that Bernie is definitely the best viable presidential candidate we're going to get on this issue by a lot, while still acknowledging that, yeah, some of his tweets sucked, and maybe he knows it. Maybe he's playing a game. Maybe he just needs to learn more about it. But, you know, when you say, oh, you should be letting in humanitarian aid, you're ignoring the precedent that countries that want to overthrow your government, that aid is not just aid, you know?
That was really wrong stance in my view, like substantively. But I think 100%. But I think some people are getting really off the like when Matt Duss tweets out the whole question of why you won't condemn a dictator is a game that Washington Hawks play to reaffirm interventionist status quo, and Bernie won't play it. That's like, calm down. There's a lot of really important work being done here by the Democratic frontrunner.
Right.
Like, that's a big deal. You would not have heard him say that in 2016.
To have a Democratic frontrunner in any campaign say we were instrumental in overthrowing the government of half a dozen Latin American countries. I mean,
also, the only one to speak on the Lula case.
Progress.
The Democratic frontrunner.
Wow.
Progress.
Wow.